Good afternoon, everybody. We apologize for the delay, but we started also the last session with some delay because of the lunch break. It's an honor to be here as the chair of this two great researchers today. The topic of this special session is on inflation, as you see in the program. First, we will have the presentation of Isabella, which is here on my left. She's a professor at Umass. She's the author, obviously, of the book How China Escaped the Shock Therapy, which was recently translated to Portuguese. I think the title, you correct me if I'm wrong, Como a China Escapou da Terapia de Choque, which is right there at the back of the room, if you want to check or get your copy. Julia Braga is associate professor at the UFF, the Federal Fluminense University, Universidade Federal Fluminense, co-editor of the Review of Keynesian Economics, and now, for some time now, current economic affairs coordinator at the IPEA, which is the Brazilian Institute for Research in Applied Economics. It's a great pleasure to have you both here discussing this interesting and very debated topic. At the moment, you have 30 minutes for your presentation. After they present, I will collect questions, and feel free to ask. I think this one is for them, and this one is for us.
Can I stand up?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for this generous introduction, and thanks so much for the invitation to have me here today. I studied at the New School for Social Research, and the Brazilian post-Keynesian Raffian economics community was always some sort of a legend that I was hoping to meet one day and have a chance to engage with one day, and it's a great honor to have this opportunity today. I suspect that for this community, or the post-Keynesian heterodox macroeconomics community more generally, I kind of appeared out of nowhere. People knew me for working on China. People knew me for working on the reform history, or they might not have known me at all, which is perfectly fine. And then suddenly there is this person who is in the newspapers talking about inflation. So I think it would be useful to give a very brief context of how I got to work on these things. So on one level, I think of How China Escaped Shock Therapy as a book about inflation in times of transition, in times of very rapid structural shifts. It is a book about China's 1980s, so the transition from a planned to a market economy, which of course comes about with very rapid structural shifts. It's also a book about the transition from a war to a post-war economy, or at least there's a chapter on that, which is another instance of a very rapid structural shift from an economy designed to produce for war to an economy that returns to producing for peace consumption. In all these instances, inflation was a major challenge, and when I was looking at what was happening in 2021, in the transition from shutdown to post-shutdown, I felt that some of the issues that I had been working on historically suddenly became very relevant to the policy debate. And I realized that some of this historical, in parts very qualitative research seemed to have something to say to the debate around the question of the return of inflation. So when I wrote this article in The Guardian, which was really an article on the stance of the mainstream of the US economics profession at the immediate aftermath of World War II, arguing that at this moment of transition, people like Paul Samuelson, Frank Knight, and so on were in favor of temporary strategic price controls as a way to buy time in the most important sectors where bottlenecks prevailed and where you had intense supply inelasticities and at the same time relatively strong demand. So this was really the background with which I wrote this Guardian article, thinking that I would basically contribute a memory of a moment in the history of economic thought that I knew had been largely forgotten, since in a book on China I included a whole chapter on this because I couldn't find any good account of these debates. What happened afterwards, probably most of you are aware, and it kind of took on a life of its own. And I want to take the opportunity today to share basically an overview of the two papers that I have done on inflation. The first one is titled Inflation in Times of Overlapping Emergencies, Systemically Significant Prices from an Input-Output Perspective. This is joint work with Jesus Lara Yauregui, who is my PhD student at Umass, Lucas Tejera, who is sitting right here, and Luisa Nassif Pires, who I think is also a proud graduate from this department. So in many ways, this paper has direct links with the tradition in this place. The idea for this paper came from me as I was trying to understand if we think that some prices matter more for overall price stability than others, how can we conceptualize this? How can we understand what systemically important prices are? However, me not being an input-output modeler, it would have been absolutely impossible for me to do this paper by myself. So that's how the collaboration with Lucas and Luisa started, and then my PhD student came in to help us run 72 different models simultaneously in R. This is just to give some context of how this project came about, and I literally think that no one of us could have done this paper by themselves, so this has been a true collaboration in that sense. From the perspective of the policy debate on inflation in 2021, very much as a continuation of the vision of price stabilization and the Great Moderation, it always struck me that the dominant way of thinking about price stabilization was in a more or less one-dimensional way, like this coin-powered horse that can only move in one dimension and that has a built-in mechanism that defines by how much it can move backward and by how much it can move forward, and we know exactly how this mechanism works, and we know exactly how we need to manipulate it in order for the horse to not jump further ahead or further back. What I would argue is that we are currently living in a time of overlapping emergencies, which means that we are dealing with intense sectoral shocks. When I'm saying overlapping emergencies, I'm referring to climate change, the pandemic, the war, the Russian war on Ukraine, and basically a situation where the global political order has become intensely unstable, which presents a context in which shocks, I believe, are becoming more systemic. One only needs to open the newspaper today to see that Southern Europe seems to have possibly a harvest in grain that is falling short by 10% of the long-run average, and in fact 60% of what the harvest was last year, which is of course a result of the heat wave and climate change, to see the connection between climate change and intense sectoral shocks. So the idea here then, to use this metaphor again, is to say, actually, if we are dealing with these extreme kinds of shocks that are intensely sectoral, then maybe we need to think about price stabilization more as we are thinking about riding an actual horse, where we can never know what exactly will trigger the horse, but we can have a better or worse understanding of the things that can unsettle the horse. So for example, if you go on a trail ride, you want to talk to someone who passes by on a bike, because once this person starts talking to you, the horse can identify this person as a human being, as opposed to some sort of a steel-powered monster or something like this, which means that the horse can locate this, which means that it can deal with the situation. You will never have a perfect understanding, but you can understand what the important things and the predictable things are that can trigger enormous movements in your horse. As most of you in this room certainly know, input-output techniques were first used in the context of strategic bombing. I am from Germany, so I feel like I can use this analogy. And in strategic bombing, the question was, what are the critical points in an industrial system, or to connect this to the horse metaphor, what are the critical trigger points, what are the points of vulnerability that when they would be bombed, would be so strategically, so systemically important that they had the ability to basically undermine the functioning of the enemy's economy as a whole. One example is, of course, an oil plant. So we are basically taking this same kind of logic, but rather than using a quantity model, we are now using a price model to try to understand what are the prices that are so important that when they shoot up have the potential to unleash overall price instability. I will give, as you would have already gathered, a kind of big picture version of this paper. Lucas Tejera is actually presenting this paper again on Thursday, and we have kind of agreed on a division of labor where he will give a very detailed account of the mathematics behind the paper, whereas I'm kind of giving you the big picture story. So this is just to give you a heads up of where I'm coming from. So the research question that we are trying to address here is, if inflation is not always and everywhere a macroeconomic phenomenon. This is not to say inflation cannot originate from the macro level, but if there can be situations where inflation does originate from the micro level, which means it can be unleashed by micro shocks on the supply side, not as the only cause of inflation, but as one possible trigger of inflation, we need to identify which sectors present points of vulnerability for monetary stability, or in other words, have the greatest potential to become systemically significant for inflation. This language of systemic significance actually comes from the literature that emerged after the financial crisis, when one of the responses to the financial crisis was to say there are some banks that are systemically important, systemically significant, to a point that they are too connected, too big to fail. So we are kind of taking the same type of idea, but translating it into the real economy in relationship to inflation. So the overall approach that we take is that we first build a Leontief price model. We then use US data with 72 sectors. And we, for the baseline model, assume that any price increase is passed on 100%. So basically that the cost increase is one-to-one translated into a price increase. We then simulate the inflation impact of a price shock to each of these 72 sectors separately, where we calibrate these shocks based first on the price volatility before the current inflation crisis. So the, if you want, so long-run tendency of prices to move, where we here built in an understanding of saying not all prices move equally. So basically kind of a Kaldorian idea of saying that some prices are much more prone to fluctuation than others. And in order to capture this difference, we simply take the historical price volatility. In the second step, we then calibrate the shocks to the price movements in the COVID-19 pandemic. So we look at the annual price change to the fourth quarter in 2021, which we are thinking of as the post-shutdown inflation. And then we are taking the second quarter of 2022, which we are thinking of as the beginning of the Ukraine war inflation. And we basically use the price movements that we observe, annual price movements that we observe empirically for these quarters to calibrate our shocks. We then rank the sectors by the total inflation impact that emerges from these separate shocks to each of the sectors in the table. And we conceptualize the first, that is the price volatility before the pandemic, as some sort of a latent systemic significance, one that is inherent in the different volatilities, but that has not yet been realized. And the second is a realized systemic significance in the sense that this is related to the actual inflation episode during the COVID pandemic. This slide is designed for you to not be able to read it. I realize that this screen is very small, so you might have had difficulties reading my previous slides. But for this one, this is actually intentional. On the left-hand side, we have the ranking of latent significance. In the middle, we have the ranking to the fourth quarter in 2021, so in the transition from the shutdown to the post-shutdown economy, and on the right-hand side for the Ukraine war inflation, where each of these yellow bars would be the direct impact of a price change on the consumption basket, and the purple part would be the indirect effect that we get from our input-output model. Now, since each of these bars basically is a separate model, because for each of these bars we set a different sector exogenous, this means that there's nothing inherent in the ways in which we are running these simulations that would constrain this distribution. In principle, these bars could all have been equally long, but what we find is that they're very much not equally long. So in other words, some industries seem to matter much more for overall inflation than others. If we zoom in, you now can see the top ranks of the latent systemic significant prices. And you can see the green dots, which actually show the magnitude of the shocks that are calibrated to the price volatility of these different sectors. And there are basically 8 sectors that show up in this initial simulation that then show up again and again in different configurations that we did for the current inflation. Namely, petroleum and coal products, oil and gas extraction, farms, food and beverage and tobacco products, chemical products, housing, utilities, and wholesale trade. Now you might, if you are actually able to read this, you might ask, why did she skip Federal Reserve Bank? Because I think we can all agree in this room that the interest rate of the Federal Reserve is a systemically significant price. We came to be pretty skeptical of the representation of the Federal Reserve system in the input-output model, which is why we don't give a lot of weight to this result. This is now the same top ranks for the fourth quarter in 2021, and you can see that the magnitude of the total inflation impact has increased, where the scale now goes up to 1.5%, before it was 0.4%, but the industries that matter are still the same, with one exception, which is motor vehicles and part dealers, which I would consider as a idiosyncratic sector that became important in the pandemic because of the very specific supply chain issues that emerged in the motor vehicle sector. So if we go back to the horse metaphor, in this case there would have been 8 sectors that we could have identified before, but there's always something that we don't know will happen, right? So the idea is not that there's like some sort of perfect foresight or whatever, but just that we can see that some are more important than others. If we move to the second quarter in 2022, we again get the same set of sectors with one additional exception, which is truck transportation, which again is a sector that was very specifically affected by the dynamics of the pandemic. So if one asks oneself, what are the pathways to systemic significance in our model, there are basically 3 dimensions. The first dimension is the weight that a sector has in the consumption basket, because that would result in a large direct effect, right? Then there's the dimension of the price volatility, so the degree by which the price changes, and then there is forward linkages. In this graph, you can see that these gray lines are indicating the average forward linkages and the average price change, and you can see that the sectors that we have identified as systemically important are the ones by and large, that are in the upper right-hand quadrant, with two exceptions, namely wholesale trade, which is just so much more, ranks so much higher in terms of its forward linkages compared to all other sectors, that it is rendered systemically significant, even though it has a below average price volatility. And the other exception is housing, which has low average price volatility and low forward linkages, but just has such a high weight in the consumption basket that it ends up being systemically important. Broadly speaking, we can, from a more intuitive perspective, I think, group these sectors into three groups, namely basic necessities, housing, food, farms, utilities, petroleum and gas products, basic production inputs, such as, again, petroleum and gas products, oil and gas extraction, and chemical products, and kind of the basic infrastructure of circulation, which we have here with wholesale trade, and then truck transportation, I think, also in parts becomes important because of the same type of position as wholesale trade. In a variation to this same modeling approach, we changed the assumptions on pass-through in order to model a form of conflict inflation, where initially, in the baseline that I showed you, we assumed that there was no profit or wage adjustment. So in other words, it's just a pass-on of costs. But of course, if firms only pass on the cost, then the profit margin actually goes down. So an alternative assumption is to say that industries adjust their prices to keep the profit share of the value of their output constant. And then thirdly, it could be that workers actually react to these price increases by trying to defend real wages, so wages could keep up with the price increase. You can now see, again, the same kind of ranking, and on the left-hand side is our baseline model. In the middle is the profit adjustment, so prices adjusting such that the profit share stays constant. On the right-hand side, wage adjustments such as to keep real wages constant. And what we find is that basically, on the one hand, the ranking is pretty stable, so this doesn't change our identification of systemically important sectors, but also that wages would have to catch up more in order to, by and large, in order to compensate for these price shocks, which I don't think is a statement on whether they actually do catch up more, but it's just a statement on that they would need to catch up more if they actually were to be compensated for inflation. Okay, with this, I would like to move to the second paper, but I would also like to check how I'm doing on time. You have more 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay, perfect. So whereas this first paper is, I mean, as you have seen, a formal model running simulations, trying to understand points of vulnerability, if you want so, for overall price stability, the second paper is a much more inductive, institutionalist, almost qualitative, descriptive statistics kind of analysis, trying to understand how firms actually react to price shocks and what follows for inflation from their reaction to these kind of price shocks. The title of that paper is Sellers' Inflation Profits and Conflict: Why Can Large Firms Hike Prices in an Emergency? This chart, which is literally straight from the BA, is one that kind of went viral and has been covered in all sorts of major newspaper outlets. It's a chart of the after-tax profit margins of non-financial corporate businesses for the United States with and without inventory adjustments. And you can see that basically the profit margins after tax had not reached the levels that they reached in 2021 that we had seen right after the war. When I was looking at this data in 2021, I started thinking about the parallel between the transition from the war to the post-war economy, because, of course, in the moment after the war, you also had a sudden shooting up of inflation. So this kind of begs the question of what is the relationship between profits and prices, and how can we make sense of apparently the corporate sector as a whole in the context of these enormous shocks in the context of these overlapping emergencies, being able to even enhance its profit margins. Taking the whole corporate, non-financial corporate sector, and I will get to a more detailed breakdown of different sectors and so on. So the research question that we are tackling in this paper is that that if it is the case that after-tax non-financial corporate profit margins have reached levels not seen since the immediate post-war era, while it was considered heretic to link this to the return of inflation not long ago, by now actually leading policy authorities like the European Central Bank, the IMF, the OECD, and so on have all acknowledged that there is a relationship between these very stark increases in profit margins and that there is and the general increase in prices, or in other words, that profits have been one of the, and I'm very consciously saying here, one of the, not the only, not the one and only driver, but one of the contributors of inflation. Now, if one was to simply blame this on greed or on corporate concentration, then this, of course, begs the question, we have had incredibly concentrated corporate sectors before the pandemic, right? Why is it the case that suddenly prices go up? So if you just take a long-run structural feature that is not suited to explain a sudden change, right? Same with greed, which is why we are actually arguing that this is basically an outcome of a specific interaction between firms' pricing strategies and the context that they operate in. We conceptualize this inflation as what Abba Lerner called a seller-induced inflation, driven by the pricing decisions of firms rather than purely excess aggregate demand. Lerner back then observed that there is no essential asymmetry between the wage element and the profit element in the price asked for the product. So in other words, there is no a priori reason why price increases could not also be driven from the profit side. We reconsider the institutionalist tradition of theories of pricing, such as Gardiner Means, John Kenneth Galbraith, and so on. And we focus on firms with market power that are price makers. We, of course, distinguish between commodity prices, where even giant firms are price takers, and industrial prices, where firms with market power are actually price makers. In going through this literature and reviewing many earnings calls of large corporations where they talk about how they are thinking about pricing decisions, we kind of condense this into 3 principles, which are not necessarily new. I'm not claiming that they are new or anything, but just like for the purposes of this paper, we are condensing this into 3 principles of strategic pricing, where we are saying that first, price-setting firms typically do not lower prices, and aside from the case of new innovative product lines, raise prices only if they expect other firms to do the same. In other words, they stick to the pack. So this is like the logic of a strategic interaction, where they only increase prices if they are expecting that the other firms in this sector would be following suit. And if they cannot expect that, then they're not going to increase prices and they're going to focus on cutting costs instead, which I think is something that helps us to make sense why in the era of globalization, where of course costs have been trending downward, corporate sectors were incredibly concentrated, but prices were surprisingly stable. I think that kind of matches quite well empirically. Second, besides a formal cartel, which of course we all recognize as something that can coordinate price hikes, there can also be norms of price leadership that enable price hikes, but there can also be sector-wide cost increases, so sector-wide shocks that can function as a coordinating mechanism for price hikes within any one industry in a kind of implicit collusion type of way, because all firms know that they have experienced the same kind of cost shock, which opens a window of opportunity for price increases that was not there before this kind of cost shock. Since all firms want to protect their profit margins and know that the other firms pursue the same goal, not least because they are actually saying this on the earnings calls, this kind of gives them cover to increase prices. Firms that do not increase prices in that kind of situation, that do not realize this window of opportunity, actually tend to be penalized by financial investors, as we have seen, for example, in the case of Walmart. Third, if demand outstrips existing capacity by a wide margin, either because of a supply or demand shock or both, firms can gain a form of temporary monopoly power, which allows them to hike prices in ways that actually increases their profit margins. So the second point was about protecting profit margins. The third point is about opportunities that actually enable firms to increase profit margins, as we have seen, for example, in the automobile sector. Absent such a temporary monopoly, firms can increase profit margins only by lowering costs. And in this context, I think that demand is taken as something that firms are actually managing as a portfolio of risks. So if you actually read how corporate leaders think about demand, they don't think of it as a given point, but they think of it as something that they can manage, that they have to navigate, that they have to basically manage as part of their overall management strategies. The description of the general inflation process that we then come up with, based on this pretty inductive approach, is to say that from a situation of stability, where profit margins by and large rise due to falling costs with given stable prices, we enter a stage of emergency where there is a major impulse that constitutes major cost shocks, whereas coming from the first paper, we argue that some cost shocks matter much more than others. Cost shocks in systemically important upstream sectors that would touch a very wide range of industries across the whole economy would matter most. And then second, the question is how firms react to this kind of cost shock. And what we argue is that firms primarily try to protect their profit margins against these rising input costs, and because of the reasons that I've tried to derive, are actually by and large relatively successful in protecting their margins, which we would describe as a propagation process from this initial price shock, which is then propagated through the economy, which actually turns the price shock into an inflation process. But there can also be instances of amplification if there are bottlenecks and so on, but we are thinking of the amplification of increasing profit margins actually as something that we observe, that we see, but not as the main tendency. Finally, workers eventually react to the decrease in living standards and the decrease in real wages so that conflict inflation can be an outcome of this process of an initial impulse followed by propagation and amplification as firms manage to protect or even increase their profit margins, and then finally workers try to regain their position, which is basically the stage that we are at now. And I mean, interestingly, this kind of stage process by now I think has been recognized by the ECB in a recent speech by Christine Lagarde. She was making statements that basically sounded as if she was summarizing these stages that we describe in our paper. However, they seem to believe that the conflict inflation can be cured with further increases in interest rates, which I am rather doubtful of. Okay, if we very briefly zoom into these different stages, we can take a quick look at the impulse stage. So these are just 4 sectors where we have plotted prices in red and profits in blue, and you can see how there has basically been a sharp increase in profits and prices in these sectors. However, I would argue that predominantly in these sectors we are actually dealing with price takers. So the most important cases of profit and price explosions are, on my mind, in the commodity markets and the oil and gas market, where, of course, firms cannot simply set prices. Shipping is an interesting case. Here's the earnings numbers from the earnings reports of Maersk, one of the largest shipping companies that we have put together. On the top, you see in orange the change in price, and in blue, the change in volume. And on the bottom, you see in in black profits and in red profit margins. And you can see that there has basically been an explosion of prices and profits happening together. Interestingly, even at times when profits started, when volume started to go down, prices kept going up. Chemicals is another interesting example, and this is just to, again, same structure of the graphs. On the top, orange is change in price, blue is change in volume, bottom is profits and profit margins. And just to give you some taste of how corporate leaders are talking about pricing on these earnings calls. So for example, the CEO of Dow Chemicals, one of the largest chemical firms in the world, replies to a question of an analyst: do you think there's enough supply disruption due to Winter Storm Elliott to kind of rebalance the I just can't pronounce this word, polyethylene market and move higher from here? And the corporate representative answers, I think there has been enough, obviously, to give good momentum to these price increases in the first quarter. And so I think we still see margins expand, as I mentioned earlier on one of the other questions. So this is one of the examples where bottlenecks emerged because of an overlapping of emergencies. You have the Winter Storm Elliott together with supply chain bottlenecks that came from the pandemic, and corporate leaders are very explicit in acknowledging that this gives them pricing power of a type that they could not enjoy in other situations. In the oil sector, it's a very interesting case. The chief executive officer of ExxonMobil, Darren Woods, for example, is claiming we have created this hole with a lot more capacity coming offline without a lot of new capacity. That capacity is not coming on. So we've got this gap, demand recovers, and we don't have the capacity to meet that, which has led to a record high refining margin. So in other words, while I would not claim that the oil prices are set by ExxonMobil, they are very much aware that by holding back certain capacity, they can keep up prices and they can actually enjoy margins that, in the case of the oil industry, have literally been at historic records. And if you look at the oil prices have been high, but they have not been as record as the profit margins, which has to do with the production costs going down, because during the shutdowns, the oil companies took capacity offline and they took the highest cost capacity offline, which left them with the lowest cost capacity, which meant that when prices went up, they enjoyed record profit margins. Okay, this is the impulse stage, and as I say, I would argue that at the impulse stage, price taking dominates over price making. At the propagation stage, firms then propagation amplification stage, firms then react to these shocks. And as this nice example from the ECB illustrates, and as I have already said in relationship to our first paper, if firms keep their profit margins constant in reaction to a cost shock, this of course means that unit profits go up, which is a matter of simple arithmetics. And I would say that this is, at the propagation stage, the main element that helps transmit these micro-level developments into the kind of profit contributions that we have seen on the macro level. So just as an example of a firm that is basically protecting its margins, here you can see the data of PepsiCo, where you can see again on the top orange price changes, blue volume changes, and yes, there are some spikes in the profit margins, but by and large it's more or less a picture of profit margin protection. Interestingly, they keep hiking prices even when volumes go down, which is what Wall Street analysts have labeled price over volume, which indicates that apparently this is not something that I think is primarily driven by demand, but that is something that is driven by an impetus to try to protect margins against costs. There are more examples here, and I just give one more, Procter & Gamble, which again you can see in red, basically the profit margins. There's a slight lift in profit margins after the pandemic, but it's not the kind of explosion that you saw in, say, shipping or oil, right? And again, you see that prices going up even when volumes are going down, which on my mind indicates that this is not primarily driven by demand. But you can also see what I tried to describe earlier, that these corporate leaders actually think of demand as something that they are managing. So here a quote from Procter & Gamble's earnings calls where they are saying, we are better positioned for dealing with an inflationary environment than we have ever been before, starting with a portfolio that is focused on daily use categories, health, hygiene, and cleaning that are essential to the consumer versus discretionary categories, which in these environments are the first one to lose focus from the consumer. So in other words, they have reshifted their portfolio to the most essential kind of hygiene products where demand is basically inelastic, which means that this gives them much more pricing power than they would have if they were to focus on, I don't know, perfume and fancy face creams or something. Of course, there is a great inequality in the changes in profit margins. On the top, this is industry level. On the bottom, this is firm level data. Of course, it is the case that not all firms are equally able to protect their margins or even increase their margins. And I think we need a much better understanding of what exactly conditions which firms are able to increase margins, which firms are able to protect margins, and what are the dimensions that drive this, this distribution. As far as I have seen, there's no good detailed sectoral level research on that out there yet. This is, I mean, I'm sure all of you have seen this. This is just the macro decomposition of profits and labor in relationship to inflation, where I think we can, broadly speaking, see the kind of stages that we have outlined, where in the first phase, profits are capturing larger shares of inflation, but as this progresses, actually labor starts to catch up, not very strongly, but still it starts to catch up. To close, if one comes from this perspective of inflation, the question is, of course, what can policy do to respond to inflation? And I would argue that if we are in such an environment where shocks are becoming more systemic and more likely, that we need an increased resilience, to use this overused buzzword, for the systemically important sectors. In the first instance, this should be a form of disaster preparedness, which allows for a quick adjustment of supply when supply is falling short. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is an example in case. If you are in a situation like, for example, Europe was last year, where you have a sudden shortfall of supply, not because of market dynamics, but because of war and sanctions, and you are an importer, and you are dependent on certain kinds of sources of gas, I think there can be policies like the one that I helped the German government design that involve a combination of price stabilization and basically subsidies to buffer parts of these impulses in order to prevent stage 2 and stage 3 from happening. I think in certain contexts, windfall-profit taxes can also play a beneficial role because they can take out some of the incentive to increase prices, but of course they would not work for propagation because keeping your profit margins constant is not going to be subject to a windfall-profit tax. I think that right now the big policy question is whether the wage increases that are finally happening in Europe in catching up with inflation, whether they will trigger another impulse that then results in another propagation and amplification, and what kind of policy tools can be put in place to make firms absorb the wage increases rather than to react with the same kind of playbook that they have learned in the last 2 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabella. Now I give the floor to Julia.
So I will base my presentation in 2 articles I wrote recently. One of them is with Franklin Serrano about, it's a review about chapter 8 of Lavoie's book about inflation theory. It has already been published by Review of Political Economy. And the other one is the one that I wrote with Ricardo Suma that was published Bulletin of Political Economy. And we do have kind of an old Phillips curve here. So this can be fun. What the main topics I will talk today is that first, I think that recent global inflation can be perfectly explained in terms of the conflicting claims approach. So I will highlight some of the points that we make in these articles. First is the difference between the closure in labor market from the output market. The short run and the long run determinants of inflation, inequality versus inflation, and also some remarks about the role of exchange rate and tradable goods in general, not only imported inputs, but also exportation price. This is one thing that I've been working on. And about also the idea of Franklin about commodity currencies. So as you all know, inflation is not a result in this approach of an objective scarcity. It arises from conflicting views about the proper distribution of income. So we do have some sort of wage-price relation, which is a reflection of distributive conflict when workers and capitalists are not satisfied with their relative shares of income. Just some clarifications. The fact that here a wage is not a demand as in the mainstream approach, but it's an element of cost. That often leads to confusion between the conflicting claims approach or, cost push and the mainstream, demand pull views of inflation. So a rise in money wage, even as a direct consequence of an increase in employment, should not be classified as demand pull inflation if the economy is below full employment. In this approach, also, we are very Raffian here. So capital and labor are basically complementary rather than smoothly substitutable, and the availability of labor is usually higher than of that of capital. We'll have this reserve army in capitalist economies. Wage inflation can happen much before full employment. But it's in the long run, in this approach, inflation it's a cost push phenomena, and also has an inertia, conflict element. So, and this is important. This is the point that we make in this later article: different roles of statesis in the output and the labor market. Difference between the timing of closure of the output gap from that of the employment gap. So full statesis, we assume full statesis on the output. We assume, the supermultiplier mechanism that works not only in the short run, but also in the medium and the long run. So this implies that the output gap closes endogenously, and the core ortan inflation will depend only on cost push and inertia conflict elements. So this is very different, from the mainstream economics that see inflation is ultimately determined by excess demand, even if you have excess of supply money, or market interest rate below the natural one, or unemployment rate below the natural or non-accelerationist rate, as is in the accelerationist Phillips curve. So I will come back to the output market, but first, in the labor market, the closure can be very slow and gradual, and the non-accelerationist rate of unemployment, non-accelerate inflation rate of unemployed, it's not an attractor. So unemployment rate may not be mean reversing at all, even though there is a sort of adjustment of the size of the labor force to employment opportunities, but labor force suffer from influence of other elements, exogenous elements. So this can be very slow and gradual. And there is no tendency for the current unemployment rate to revert to the same equilibrium rate of unemployment after a shock. So we really criticize this concept. We don't find it very useful at all. A temporary night relief, if it's temporary, only exists in very specific situations. If it's assumed that expected or past inflation is always fully incorporated in nominal wage, which is recently haven't been the case for the last decades, or real profit markup is exogenous giving. This is, I think, it's kind of a difference from, more Clarkian view as Isabella. We tend to find that firms can only manage nominal profit market, not real profit markup. So the extent to which money wage increases actually incorporate past or inflation inertia will depend on the bargaining power of workers. And we noticed a reduction in the bargaining power of workers in the last decades in the advanced countries. There's a list of reasons for this, the reduction of unionization, the threat of delocalization, institutional change in the labor market reduce the bargaining power of workers. So workers actually can't incorporate all the past or expected inflation to money wage. But it's also true that persistently low trend unemployment rates tend to strengthen the bargaining power of workers. So in the output market, things are not too complicated as in the labor market. Full hysteresis, if we assume that there is a full hysteresis, strong hysteresis on output, this implicates that there is a mean reversing tendency of capacity utilization, via the supermultiplier model. We do think there is some sort of normal utilization of capacity. The output gap tends to close itself automatically after persistent increases in demand. The initial rise in the output, the actual degree of capacity utilization tends to be temporary. This is the point. As the level of growth of productivity capacity follow the trend of effective demand via induced investment. But if there are a lot of supply restrictions, these supply restrictions turn disclosure not as very fast as it should be in normal circumstances. So, and this kind of restrictions is like a pandemic, a war, climate change. So, hey, we have them all, right? We have all these elements together in a very specific moment of history, yeah? So it's like that we enter in this neoclassical world that we all criticize of scarcity. Yeah, we were in this neoclassical world, kind of, with the pandemic, with the Ukraine war, right? So this is a very unique and specific moment. This is more like an exception than a normality, right? And as Isabella mentioned in her presentation, climate change catastrophes is becoming more and more frequently and more intense, which is kind of scared. But this exception, when they are especially all together with all this intensity, what it happens is that the output cannot respond to increase in demand. So we here have an excess demand problem, but not because of a rise of excess of high demand, but because of lower supply restriction. So just to illustrate, the profit margin in the fossil fuel sector this is the crack spread for the fossil fuel, which is a financial indicator that, you know, it's a proxy for the profit margin. It did rise a lot lately. That was an extraordinary, actually, rise in profit margin, as Isabella points, in the energy sector. But it has already diminished. And this, you know, since it's the basic product, as Zrafa points, the commodity that is necessary to produce all the other commodities, of course, this will damage and will influence all the other prices. So, yeah, as Isabella points, there's a generalized profit margin since firms could pass through this basic cost fully into prices. But if you assume that there is a tendency to close the output gap, so this, you know, demand pool profit margin adjustment cannot be the leading cause of longer run inflation, since it tends to peter out as output gap close. So we think that it's unrealistic to assume that firms will always set a real profit margin, since it requires firms to both have perfect foresight of cost increases and also the power to pass through this cost fully into price without attracting competitors. So this did happen. It was very intense, as Isabella mentioned, but it's temporary, right? So another recent fact is that this is the US low wages, a proxy for low wages, average hour earnings of production on and non-supervisory employees in private sector. It did raise the level of increase in nominal wages. It was like historically like 3% since the 90s, and now it's like 4 to 5%. So it also happened, right? There was also, you know, a reaction of wages from the increase in the cost production of the basic material. But, well, if you see the real wages, you see that it's not raising very much as historical in historical terms. It's just like 2% in the US increase in real wage. So you still have a scenario of lower bargaining power of workers. So here I think it's important to differentiate inequality from inflation. So inequality is the result of the interaction between wages and prices. So functional inequality, what I mean the functional inequality, high real profit margins and low real wages, can happen with higher or low inflation, right? And in this scenario, as Isabella pointed, there is a lot of instruments that policymakers can use to deal with this scenario. A windfall tax with a variable tax rate, subsidies to consumers that has an indirect effect on price, regulated prices, but also measures to strengthen the bargaining power of workers. And also, the inflation target, it's an important topic to debate. So, how to defend a higher inflation target if we think it's all about profit inflation? So, if it's all about profit inflation, it would be better to have zero inflation, right? But it's not. This is the point. And why aren't we doing a big noise about this in the advanced countries? This week, that probably Fed will rise again the interest rate. So a higher interest rate target can let wages react to past inflation without raising too much policy interest rate, right? And I can't defend this here in Brazil if there is no debate in the advanced countries. This is very difficult. It's a very conservative society, It's very difficult for me to, we have to rise inflation target here in Brazil. Well, the Fed is not doing nothing. The Euro Central Bank is not raising inflation target. And who is defending the rising inflation target? Blanchard defended. Why are we not defending? So it's true that the accelerationist curve flattened in the 2000. This is the US case, and you have a lot of evidence in the literature of the flattening of the accelerationist curve. But it's also true there is kind of a negative relation between unemployment and inflation, right? And we have to deal with it. So, and finally, some remarks about the role of nominal exchange rates and commodity prices that we also do in this review of Lavoie book, chapter 8 book, and I promise not to take too long here. So we think that it's necessary to have a sound theory of distribution and relative prices to explain inflation and the behavior of commodity prices. In the short run, I think that we can all agree that collections view that the food and raw materials prices are demand determined, as their supplies is rigid. But in the middle and long run, supply eventually reacts, as higher prices and extraordinary profits always attract new investments. So there is an increase in supply, even if it takes a while, and it can take more time if we have these permanent shocks that Isabella mentioned in her presentation. This is actually something that we have to deal with as also. So supply reaction happens even if in sectors that depend on climate or agriculture, or have a powerful international cartel, such as in the oil industry. Actually, we are seeing this in Brazil this year. Brazil is gaining market share on oil and soybean. Now it's price volume over price. Here it's commodity. It's price taker, but even though it's not a strategy, but no. The point is, as Rafian point, Gariani's point, a persistent and structural change in relative prices of commodities is, at the end of the day, a reflection of changes in the cost of production in the long run. So the role of imported commodities, energy, and raw materials. If we think about an open economy and a specific country, inflation can rise because of rising important input price. This complicates the distributive conflict since real wage will fall even if firms keep real market constant as a consequence of one of these three possibilities: rising commodity price, exchange rate depreciation, or an increasing amount of imported raw material. This really complicated the conflict for an individual country, right? But also, we point that there is also a role of exported or tradable goods in general, not only imported prices, because of the law of one price. So even a country that is a net exporter of raw material, international commodity price can influence domestic prices. So Brazil, it's a good example of that. This happens when producers are price takers and will supply the internal market only with a price that provides a markup as high as the one that can be obtained by exporting. So here, Brazil prices are denominated of these export goods. Prices are denominated in dollar, but wages are denominated in local domestic currencies. This means that markup of these exporters is affected by international market, and so a rise in commodity price or exchange rate variation increase their markup. We have witnessed this here in Brazil very strongly with Petrobras dividends, which was huge. This was influenced both because of the rise in dollar commodity price, but also because of devaluation of the real. So the external inflation is not about imported inflation. It's also about exportation price for a single country. And this is the dynamic of exportation price go very close to the dynamic of importation price. This is all in dollar terms, and goes close to the commodity price dynamic, right? It's very much correlated. And finally, what Franklin's very interesting point, I think that it deserves more research in the future. Therefore, changes it's about commodity currencies that can maybe do the connection between what the Fed did and distributive elements and exchange rate. It's like a channel, very sophisticated channel. So changes in commodity prices or exchange rates have an additional indirect role in decreasing real wages, aggravating the internal distributive conflict. At the same time, if dollar appreciates or domestic currency depreciates, the dollar value of wages of commodity producers will fall. So the reduction in dollar wages can deflagrate an increase in the supply of commodities and a reduction of the prices, since the price tends to meet the cost element in the competition among producing countries for the world market shares. So the end result of this is the fall of the dollar commodity price and the terms of trade find a causal nexus from commodity currencies, exchange rate movements to commodity prices. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. So now I will collect a couple of questions. I ask you to introduce yourself and then use the microphone otherwise. Louis-Philippe at the back of the room.
I have two quick, first of all, thank you both. I really enjoyed your talks. Got two quick questions and a comment. The first question is for Isabella. How much of your model do you consider as the new general theory of inflation, and how much do you think is special case related to the pandemic? You kind of alluded to this in your talk as well. The second question is whether you can choose to answer or not, but because it opens up a can of worms, the use of monetary policy to fight this type of inflation, reminding you that the Fed tomorrow will probably announce an increase in interest rates. The quick comment is this, Isabella, in your slide on the inflation process, you put conflict inflation at the end. And you said, oh, workers. And I've always had difficulty with that because it seems to place blame with workers. But, you know, when you talk about firms protecting their margins and et cetera, why can't we see that as conflict inflation as well? You know, we need to maybe shift it takes two to tango, they argue, but why can't firms be the leading actor in that sort of dance on conflict inflation? Thank you, and thank you again.
Thank you, Louis-Philippe. Any other question? Guilherme?
Good evening, I'm Guilherme from the University of Pisa. My question is to Julia, sorry. So you talked about the role of tradable prices, in particular in Brazil. Which policies you think can be adopted to avoid that the prices of tradable food and fuels can be adopted in Brazil, in particular in the case of food that affects a lot the income of lower income people?
Any other question? Okay, José Bruno?
Thank you for the presentations. I'm José Bruno from the University of Sheffield. Isabella, in your graph of the processes, of the stages of inflation process, I wanted you to clarify at the end of the process if you see this as we complete these rounds and go to the conflict round, if you see this as a process where inflation stabilizes at a higher level, or if this is something that leads to a spiral, because that was not clear to me in your talk about your position. Just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, so one more question, then you go for the second round. Okay, so Levrero?
I have a question for Isabella and one for Julia. For Isabella, the European Central Bank and also the Bank of Italy completely denied that the very strong increase in the profit share is due to profit inflation. They always argue that it is only the result of the adjustment of prices by a firm to the increase in the cost of some import goods. So I would like to have your opinion, because you know, in order to argue that you have a profit inflation, you must show that there are indeed precisely an increase of the profit margins by the firms, and this is not easy to do. And always to Julia, another question. It regards what you have said about the increase of the interest rate by the central banks. I think that at least for the European Central Bank, one reason is also to avoid a depreciation of the euro, in order to minimize the effect of the increase of the price of imported goods which are in dollars. So the effect of this on price inflation in Europe. And so, yes, I agree that the increase in the rate of interest cannot be the right way to face inflation, but this is one point in favor of this increase. To Julia, with respect to the effect of an increase in the international prices in countries like Argentina or Brazil, why you must necessarily, yes, the prices are fixed, I mean, in the international market of some goods, but why you must necessarily raise the price of your export goods? Why you do not try to acquire a larger share of the international market by do not sell at a higher price if you have an increase in the international prices?
Okay, do you prefer to answer those and then we collect more questions, or, yeah. So, Alexander, you are the first one for the next round. Yeah, you can use this one as well, yeah.
You want to start? Okay. Yeah, thank you for great questions. So the second paper is absolutely not the idea of a general theory of inflation. It's actually quite the contrary of that. It's the idea of trying in a kind of institutionalist, descriptive statistics kind of way, in an exploratory, and in this paper, if you have read it, we say 7 times at least that this is an exploratory paper, that we are trying to come up with a heuristic of trying to make sense of the dynamic of the current inflation process by taking seriously how corporate leaders are talking about their own pricing decisions. So this is really very much, I mean, kind of an inductive form really of trying to make sense of what is going on. I that being said, I do think that corporate leaders have learned important lessons from the current inflationary episode, and that they have learned that they can increase prices without without actually harming their market shares and actually protecting their profit margins even when volumes go down. And if there is some truth to our observation that there's a coordination element to this, and that also the earnings calls play a certain role in this coordination, then I would argue that next time around, when there is a major cost shock, they have a playbook in hand which they can just pull out of the drawer and can be fairly certain that the other firms will react in the same way. So in this round, we still saw a lot of surprise. They often express surprise themselves, just how much price they could take without seeing their market shares decline. And I think that this is now a new kind of norm, if you want so, that might have emerged to some extent. But maybe to be clear, I fully agree with Julia that this increase in real markups is at the same time temporary. So what I'm saying is if there's another mega shock, they would know how to react. To the question of whether conflict is an outcome or not, there's a case to be made to say the conflict starts the moment that firms basically defend their profit margins against the cost shock, and thereby, basically they are the ones who start the conflict. I would agree with that broadly. I mean, when we wrote this paper, we tried to first get this logic of cost shock and then firm behavior as a reaction to a cost shock very clear, to make explicit that this is a reaction to a cost shock, so that the impulse really comes from the cost shock, which is why we kind of map the conflict stage as the one when labor actually react and you get a direct confrontation between labor and capital. But I can see a case to describe this in terms of saying that the firms being able to basically completely protect themselves against the cost shock, thereby not carrying any of the burden of the emergency at the end of the day, that this is actually the beginning of the conflict. To Bruno's question of whether I see this as a process that eventually peters out or one that enters into a spiral, very much in the spirit of saying that this is the attempt of trying to capture, in an inductive fashion, real social dynamics around pricing. I would say that whether this ends up creating a spiral or not is at the end of the day a matter of how strong labor is in reacting. So to what extent is labor actually able to catch up, right? And there have been, different stories on that in different countries, but in the Eurozone, for example, the picture for the main part has been one of declining real wages and now the attempt of catch-up. And then the second question is whether firms will be able to react to these catch-up wage increases by basically entering a new round of protection of profit margins, right? I would say that the fact that the huge shocks that we have seen from the energy and commodity markets are actually easing just at the time that wages are starting to catch up, indicates that there's definitely a lot of space on the part of firms to absorb the wage increase. But whether they absorb it or not, I think at the end of the day, is not determined. It's a matter of conflict inflation. It's a matter of struggle. It's a matter of policy response. It's a matter of public coverage of the kind of profit dynamics that we have seen and so on. Then on the ECB, I think there's a lot of semantic confusion around the question of what we mean by profit inflation. If you are an economy like the United States and the fossil fuel industry is a domestic industry and you have had a gigantic price and profit explosion in the fossil fuel industry, then I think, and the rest of the corporate sector basically manages to protect its margins by and large, then, as a mere matter of summing this up, you get an increase in margins, right? So in the US, it would look like that. In Europe, where a lot of the energy is imported, you have basically and sorry to be so Euro and US centric, I'm just trying to talk about the things I have studied, not to say that this doesn't matter for Latin America or anything. But if you're an importer, then of course this is an external cost shock. And I think that Lagarde and Schnabel and so on have been very explicit that firms have been able to fend off this cost shock. And if they keep their margins constant in response to this cost shock, unit profits go up. And in the macro decomposition, we see a large contribution of profits to inflation. That's what the ECB has been saying. In fact, I would say that Isabel Schnabel has been really a pioneer of that line of argument. She started arguing this already in March, April 2022, which was way ahead of the curve of many others. But the irony is that even though they acknowledge this, and even the IMF's latest study on Europe is making the exact same argument, but they then say, okay, therefore we have to hike interest rates even harder to prevent the wage catch-up, to prevent like the exact kind of spiral that Bruno was asking about, whereas I would say, from a distributional perspective, it's disastrous if wages are not allowed to catch up, and they have to catch up. The question is, how do you prevent the wage catch-up from unleashing that kind of spiral? And I think that interest rate hikes is kind of the most brutal, least targeted, most costly way of doing that, especially in the European context where, you have the German economy, which is the largest, one of the most important economies, of course, in Europe, already being in a technical recession. We just got the PMI numbers that look disastrous and so on. So in that kind of context, I think what you need is investment to improve the resilience of the sectors that then, unleash the kind of dynamics that we have discussed, right? Rather than pushing down the whole economy because of an inflation that really originated from these kind of sectoral dynamics. This is also an answer to Louis Rochon's question of interest rate hikes.
Thank you for the questions. For the food prices, the policy measures that can be adopted, lowering the tax for final consumers, all the instruments that I listed in the presentation, I think that can be adopted. Also, and this one I wrote an article about this here in Brazil, defending more tax to the exporters, because the commodity exporters here in Brazil really pay lower taxes compared to the industry. So raising the profit tax will not have a reflection in the internal prices. The internal price will not be raised because of an extra tax on profits of the exportations, because they are price takers. This will only reduce the profit, the profit markup, the markup, the profit margin. But also, it's very important the role of monetary policy itself. Because what we had here in Brazil is that we had a great devaluation of the real related to the US dollar. And whenever we have the exchange rate devaluation, there is a rise in in the food prices, internal food prices. So managing the interest rate, and we do have a trade-off between interest rate and exchange rate. So not lowering too much as we did, because we put it in 2% during the pandemic, it was not even covering the premium, the risk premium. So we do have to pay attention to the differential, including the risk premium, because we did this, and I've seen, besides Argentina or countries that have a huge balance of payment problem, we did this, and it was negative, and our currency devaluated much more than the other countries, than the other emerging countries. So we boosted, because of the monetary policy, we boosted the shock, the external shock, via the exchange rate devaluation. So also a monetary policy has a role. This is my point. But also you can think about, industrial policy, producing the fertilizers, credit to, and Nelson is here, our public bank, it's giving credit to families, to food families, producers. This is very important, familiar, because the families are the ones that produce for the internal market. And I don't know if I got your point, Livreiro. I don't know if I got it. You said that why not increasing market share and not passing to internal prices? Is that what you said? I don't know if I got it.
In the international price of the commodities, you necessarily have an increase in the markup, no?
Yeah.
And a fall in the real wages. So my question is, looking at what occurred also in Italy, why you must necessarily exploit, in a sense, the depreciation of your currency by not reducing your export price, trying to enlarge your share in international trade?
Yeah, actually, we are doing this in Brazil. Brazil, I don't know if I got this right, sorry. But Brazil is increasing market share for oil and soybean. This, in the last 10 years, it's a tendency. And even though we have this we have increased a large share, we pass to internal prices the external shock. So I think it's just a problem of maximizing profits. I don't know. It's like, okay.
Okay, thank you for this first round of questions. So as I promised, Alexander, and then Fabinho.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Alexander Goshansky from the University of Greenwich in London. Isabella, my question is to you. You have highlighted this element of tacit collusion as a means to protect profit margins or realized markups, essentially, of these firms. Do you think that, on the one hand, when a cost shock appears, this tendency of tacit collusion can even lead to an increase, would be sufficient to lead to an increase in these profit margins, which you have now in your presentation linked mainly to demand and supply shocks, or excess capacity, a decline in capacity, an increase in capacity utilization. And the second point, which, if I understood your paper, which I enjoyed a lot correctly, the question of whether this inflationary dynamic can lead to a decline in the price elasticity of demand that is absorbed by consumers, and whether this would be another way to increase profit margins to a level beyond what it was previously. And as we know in mainstream theories, both of these arguments are there. So markups are a function of the price elasticity of demand. Markups or tacit collusion happens more likely in industries where price increases are to be expected. But this is something that we don't really have a lot in heterodox theories where the determinants of markups are different. I would like to hear your perspective on that.
Hi. I want to talk a little bit about inflation theory, because I think we have a challenge for heterodox inflation theory, since our models, main models to explain inflation, are models of conflicting inflation, which are a kind of appropriate models when dealing with a country, closed economy in a sense. When we introduce an open economy in which price of commodities have an important influence on inflation dynamics not only in one country but in various countries, we have as a theorist to explain also the dynamics of these prices, and the dynamics of this price involve elements that are not so the same kind of elements that we have in our conflicting claims models, because we have to deal with flexible price reactions to shocks, we have to deal with geopolitics, we have to deal with monetary arrangements that influence the dynamics of the commodity price. And I think that Julia, with Franklin, they are trying to deal with it, but we have also to have more effort in trying to explain the dynamics of commodity price, not as a supply and demand, because we know that we have costs, and costs are the determinant in the long run. So we have to explain the dynamics of, at least for a long-run theory of commodity price, for the dynamic of commodity costs in the long run. Okay? Thank you.
So we have 3 more that already asked me. You, and then Gregor, and actually I ask you to be brief, so we have time for our presenters to reply.
Thank you. My name is Pedro from City University. I have a question for Julia. In your story, as I understand, when you have these price shocks, these sudden price shocks because of pandemic, war, or whatever it is, and if you have a price-taking economy, these shocks, by kind of almost accounting, they will be translated in higher markups and higher profit rates. Even if workers can defend themselves, it's going to take a while, so the markups will increase at the first stage. So can we say that this is instead of a profit-led inflation, is this an inflation-led markup rise? Thank you.
Yes, Gregor?
Gregor Simoniuk, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I have short questions for each speaker, one for each. For Joanna, I don't know if you're aware of the Indonesian situation where there's sort of a quota that has to be supplied to the domestic market in certain commodities, for instance, coal, at a cap price, and when the world market price goes above it, the domestic economy is shielded from that. I was wondering what you were thinking about whether this could also be done in Brazil, or why it couldn't be. For Isabella, I was wondering about discussions of the low carbon transition. I mean, even if you're not advocating for a carbon price, but there are some increases in certain costs expected, and this is usually discussed in terms of costs to the consumers and carbon dividends that help alleviate these pressures. But what do you think if this happens at the intermediate output stage? Wouldn't that also introduce these kinds of dynamics that you have been describing, and have you seen people taking note of that? Thank you.
Okay, thanks to both presenters. I have a comment on what Julia presented. Also from some comments that we had from the audience. So what I see are 3 elements, basically. I wouldn't tend to think that much in terms of conflicting claims model, because there was arguably few resistance on the worker side. So there is conflict, but it comes mainly from profit earners. So I will probably tend to think more in terms of price markup. If we look at the price markup, there are 3 elements, I will say, in the current surge in inflation. First, an unexpected increase in costs that cannot be marked up, an unexpected increase in costs that was marked up by firms, and an increase in the markup. Now, I think the increase in the markup was more stark in the US, probably not so much in Europe, as also Enrico Sergio Leverer was pointing. But anyways, the last 2 elements, increase in the markup, marked up increase in costs, both change the functional distribution of income. So as we had a permanent change in the functional distribution of income, so as Isabella said, we passed the propagation and amplification stage, what are now the policy implications for this? You know, we cannot, shall we go back to strategic price controls even if we pass this phase, or is it time for income policies as in the 70s with trade unions and industrial associations sitting at a table and deciding how to make up for this shift in the functional distribution of income that happened?
Thank you. So now we'll give some time for them to reply. I ask you kindly to be brief so that we have also time to the people to check Isabella's book at the back of the room.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Alex. This is a great question. I mean, I think there are cases where the tacit collusion itself can result in increased margins or realized markups or whatever you want to call it. First of all, there can be an overshooting, right? I mean, in this context of extremely uncertain environments, it's extremely hard to know where these important input costs will be, right? And if everybody expects to be protecting profit margins, then to be sure to protect profit margins, you're probably going to increase more than necessary. And if you have a sense that everybody else is also behaving in that way, it could, in principle, lead to that, right? And another dynamic that I think one can observe if one reads the earnings calls sequentially is that the firms become more confident in talking about price increases. Then eventually it ceases a bit as the public debate became very hot. I think they started to realize that it might not be the wisest thing to go on earnings calls and talk very loudly about, what very much sounds like price gouging if you cite it in a context that is not the earnings call itself, right? So, but abstracting from that kind of public opinion effect, I think that there is a dynamic of becoming more self-confident and realizing that you can actually increase margins and by taking ever more price. So in some sectors, I think there is such a dynamic. I'm not saying this is a generalized dynamic, but I think there are cases of that kind of thing going on. The decline in price elasticity of demand is an interesting one and actually something that I skipped over entirely in the presentation. So one of the things that we also see in the earnings calls, and this is actually something that also people who are analysts at Bloomberg have been pointing out and have been labeling excuseflation, is that firms seem to be very confident that when consumers hear in the news every day about grain price shocks, energy price shocks, about supply chain issues and so on, that they seem to be more willing to pay higher prices than they would be if there's no clear reason for the price increase. So kind of the psychological or even social dimension where kind of the price is also a social relationship between the firm and their customers. And if they were to just hike prices out of the blue, customers might react in a different way than if they are hiking prices in this context where it kind of makes sense to consumers, which is something that firms also talk about. Then the question of models of conflict inflation and closed economy dynamics of commodity prices, this actually goes back to the previous question of whether the conflict inflation is an outcome or not, right? And I think one way of thinking about it is that, if you have an inflation that is set off by a price shock that is translated into inflation by the ability of firms to protect their margins, and then eventually workers react to that, then if firms react to this wage increase, again, by increasing prices, then you could actually have a conflict inflation that then is domestic, that does no longer require the external shock, right? But is kind of an outcome of the external shock or the sectoral shock if that sector is within your economy. The question of the low carbon transition, one of the striking findings from the paper with Lucas and others is, I think, that we very consistently find that oil and gas products and oil and gas extraction are by a very far margin the most important industries for price stability, which I think has some implications for purely relying on carbon pricing for a green transition. So I think this is like kind of a cautious tale that needs to be further unpacked what this means. And we are actually working on a follow-up paper. We are trying to develop this. But also, I mean, if you let very large price and profit explosions happen in the fossil fuel sector, then this leads to a dynamic where the profitability in the fossil fuel sector by far outpaces that in the green energy sector, which then has led very concretely to large oil corporations withdrawing their pledges for investments in renewables, large institutional investors becoming more skeptical around investing in renewables. So you could kind of have you take one step forward, the fossil fuel industry supply becomes more constrained, you have a pickup of demand, prices explode, and then you kind of take a step backwards again because your investments have become less attractive. So I think there is an important cautionary tale here, whether allowing these kind of profit explosions to happen in that kind of fashion is not at the end of the day undermining a green transition, and that in some ways goes against the logic of ever higher fossil fuel prices will be great for a green transition, right? On the income policies question, so in Germany we actually had a so-called concerted action last year, which, I mean, coming from the more traditional perspective of wage price spirals, exclusively focused on wages. So unions were demanded to pledge to not have any major wage increases, whereas at the same time firms were not demanded to make any pledges to not increase their margins or to absorb some part of the gigantic cost shock that was already there when the concerted action happened. And I think this is a huge mistake. And I think that in countries like Germany that have these kind of corporatist institutions that can facilitate income policies, they could actually also be used as an instrument to now try to make firms at least absorb some of the wage increases given the trajectory of inflation that we have seen.
So just a few remarks. If it's profit-led inflation, okay, let the public think about it. It's profit-led inflation. It's okay. Let them be angry with the firms. Okay, the firms, I mean, the point is, in the last decades, the profit margin was still high. It was high already. And the real wages was low. And we didn't have inflation. That's my point, okay? Just my point. But you are completely right that there was a huge rise in profit margin during the pandemic. I mean, if you call it profit-led, it's okay. Let the public be angry, not just to the government that because of taxes, but because of this corporation that distribute dividends to CEOs, you know. It's very unequal way. Yeah, I think it's worthwhile to point this. And also about cap price, I think here in Brazil we have a state oil company, which is really important. And Nelson was the one that defended a raise finance investments in deep water, enlarging the government share, which was really important because now we can practice a price that it's not that high as it was last year, right? We can manage not to be so close to the movements of the international market, but at the same time not lowering the profit of the state because it's also open, it is a capital open company, so you have to have a fine tune about that. But it's to have a state company in strategic sectors of basic goods, it's really important as well.
Okay, so I think we don't have time for another round of questions. I thank you very much, our speakers today, for this wonderful discussion.